Some writers write with ink, others write with the very dust of the land itself. John Ernst Steinbeck, who would come to be known as the conscience of American literature, was a product of that land, California's fertile and unforgiving Salinas Valley. Before he became one of the greatest storytellers of the 20th century, he was just a quiet, observant, and somewhat misfit boy. This story is not about the glorious road to the Nobel Prize. It is the story of the muddy paths, the failures, and the stubborn quest that built that road. He was born on February 27, 1902, in Salinas, California. This was a vast agricultural landscape, bordered by mountain ranges to the east and west, where fog from the ocean embraced the fields. Locals called it the salad bowl of the world. Steinbeck's father was the treasurer of Monterey County. His mother was a former teacher. So, unlike the characters in his novels, John was not born into poverty. He was the child of a middle-class family growing up in a house filled with books. But John's soul did not fit inside that house. He was in love with the stories of the migrant workers on the streets and the field hands sweating in the soil. From a young age, he would lock his bedroom door and write stories for hours. His mother sensed that this introverted boy would one day be a genius, but for his father, he was just a dreamer with his head in the clouds. By 1919, John had reached university age. To meet his family's expectations, he enrolled at Stanford University. However, Stanford was too buttoned up and too rule-bound for a free spirit like John Steinbeck. He wasn't interested in a degree. He only wanted to learn what he wanted to learn. Thus, his university life turned into a strange adventure spanning 6 years. He would attend school, then drop out and disappear for months. Where did he go? To the fields, to sugar beet factories, to road construction crews. He preferred to learn about life, not from professors, but from workers with calloused hands. He came to know the lonely and harsh world he would later describe in Of Mice and Men during these periods of escape, sleeping in workers' bunks. The people he met in those years would become the nameless heroes of his future novels. In 1925, John Steinbeck made a radical decision. He left university without a diploma. He had some saved money in his pocket and only one dream in his mind: to be a writer. He made the classic mistake of every aspiring writer and hopped on a freighter to New York. He thought fame was waiting for him in the big city. Yet New York was ready to chew up and spit out this young Californian. His writing career was about to end before it began. He tried journalism and was fired. He worked as a laborer on the construction of Madison Square Garden. While his hands cracked from the concrete, his soul cracked from homesickness. New York was not for him. He was a writer of silence, not crowds. He went hungry, was rejected, and finally, accepting defeat, he returned home to California on a cargo ship. When he returned, the year was 1928. Steinbeck found a job as a caretaker in a cabin on the shores of Lake Tahoe, a place no one visited in winter. Outside, there were meters of snow, and he was in absolute solitude. It was in that silence that John Steinbeck began to search for his true voice. By the light of a kerosene lamp, he wrote his first novel, Cup of Gold. This book was not yet the work of the social realist Steinbeck we know. It was a romantic and historical fiction, telling the life of the famous pirate Henry Morgan. When Cup of Gold was published in 1929, John Steinbeck was 27 years old. His book was in print, but the success he expected did not come. Critics ignored the book, and sales were non-existent. Furthermore, in a twist of fate, just 2 months after his book was published, the Wall Street stock market crashed. The Great Depression had begun. As America entered a dark age, John Steinbeck stepped into the 30s as a penniless man with no future, yet stubbornly determined to write against all odds. No one knew it yet, but the pen that would tell of America's great pain was being sharpened at that very moment. In the early 1930s, America was in the grip of the darkest economic crisis in its history, the Great Depression. Banks were failing, factories were closing, and people waited in long lines for a slice of bread. For John Steinbeck, this crisis was not just in newspaper headlines, but on the empty plates in his kitchen. He was no longer alone. In 1930, he had married Carol Henning, a woman who was intelligent and just as stubborn as he was. The newlyweds settled into a small summer cottage in Pacific Grove, owned by Steinbeck's father. This was a modest shack nestled among pine trees, battered by the restless waves of the ocean. In those years, the Steinbecks were literally penniless. Dinner often consisted only of fish they caught from the ocean and vegetables gathered from the garden. Their electricity was frequently cut off, and they huddled together for warmth on cold winter nights. But this poverty did not kill Steinbeck's creativity. On the contrary, it fueled it. Carol was not just a wife, she was his first editor, his harshest critic, and his comrade at the typewriter. Steinbeck wrote, Carol corrected, but the rejection letters from publishers never seemed to end. The pastures of heaven and to a God unknown were written during this period, but they brought neither money nor fame. During these years of hopelessness, he met someone who would radically change his life and philosophy: Ed Ricketts. Ed Ricketts was a marine biologist living in a formaldehyde-smelling lab among the canneries of Monterey. He was not just a scientist studying sea creatures, he was a philosopher, a music lover, and a bohemian, questioning the meaning of life. Steinbeck would sit for hours in Ricketts' lab, discussing life, biology, and human nature. Ricketts taught him this: do not judge people, simply observe them, just as you would study a crab or an octopus. This perspective laid the foundation for the non-judgmental, compassionate tone in Steinbeck's novels. Ed Ricketts would later be immortalized as the character Doc in the novel Cannery Row. By 1935, Steinbeck's luck finally turned. Tortilla Flat, the fruit of these years, kneaded with poverty and friendship, was published. The novel told the story of the paisanos, Mexican-Americans living in the hills of Monterey, fond of wine and idleness, whom society viewed as riffraff. Steinbeck depicted them with an honorable and legendary air, like the knights of King Arthur's Round Table. Unexpectedly, the book became a bestseller. Hollywood bought the film rights. Suddenly, Steinbeck achieved the financial comfort he had lacked for years. But instead of celebrating success, he was uncomfortable with it. He hated the attention fame brought. He didn't want to play the role of the writer. He just wanted to write. But outside, the world was changing. As the Great Depression deepened, tension in the California fields was rising. Fruit pickers were forced to work in inhumane conditions and were violently suppressed when they demanded their rights. Steinbeck could no longer remain a writer who just told colorful town stories. He went into the field. He witnessed the strikes of agricultural workers, spoke with union leaders, and saw their hunger and anger with his own eyes. These observations turned into the 1936 novel In Dubious Battle. This was Steinbeck's first major political novel. He was no longer a romantic storyteller, but an angry realist, taking the side of the human being crushed by the gears of the system. As 1936 came to an end, John Steinbeck was now a recognized writer, but his real great battle was just beginning. Dust clouds rising from the east, from Oklahoma and Texas, were driving thousands of desperate people toward the California border. Steinbeck could feel this approaching flood of humanity and the tragedy that would ensue. His pen was ready for the greatest task history would place upon him. The seeds of the grapes of wrath were about to be sown in those very fields. By 1937, John Steinbeck was no longer just a local Californian writer. He was the harbinger of the approaching storm. As dust clouds rising from America's interior, the Dust Bowl blocked out the sun, Steinbeck prepared to shake people with his words. This period would be not only a literary peak for him, but also a story of spiritual exhaustion. The year is 1937. Steinbeck published Of Mice and Men. It was written using a technique never tried before. It could be read as a novel or performed as a play on stage. George and Lennie, one sharp and protective, the other hulking, but with the mind of a child. Two migrant workers. Their dream of owning their own land was actually a symbol of the innocence lost by all of America. The book was so successful that it moved to Broadway stages before the ink was even dry. But this success did not make Steinbeck happy. He hated the posh invitations in New York, the eyes fixed upon him. At that moment, his mind was not on the intoxication of success, but on the children dying of hunger in California's muddy valleys. That same year, the San Francisco News asked him for a series of articles on the condition of migrant workers. Steinbeck converted an old bakery truck into a camper and hit the road. The scene he witnessed was horrific. Hundreds of thousands of people from Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas had fled drought and dust storms, seeking refuge in California, which they thought was the promised land. But what they found was not heaven, but hell. They lived in tin shacks by riverbanks, dying in filth. Locals called them Okies and despised them. Police tried to deport them. Steinbeck talked to people in these muddy camps, ate with them, and saw babies dying of starvation. He wrote in his diary in those days, "I must write this. I must rip a reader's nerves to rags." He was no longer just an observer. He was an angry man. In 1938, he locked himself in his home in Los Gatos. He began writing one of the most impactful novels in history, The Grapes of Wrath. This was not a writing process, it was a war. Steinbeck worked at a superhuman pace. His wife, Carol, in that room where the sound of the typewriter never ceased. Both supported him and edited the text. It was Carol who found the book's imposing title, The Grapes of Wrath. As Steinbeck wrote, he doubted himself. He wrote in his journal, "The book is not going well. I am not worthy to tell this story." But he did not stop. He crafted the Joad family's epic journey, Tom Joad's rebellion, and Ma's resilience, word by word. In April 1939, The Grapes of Wrath was published and hit America like an atomic bomb. The book sold out as soon as it hit the shelves. But its impact was not just literary, It created a political earthquake. Large landowners and banks hated the book. They declared Steinbeck a liar, a communist, and a traitor. In his own hometown of Salinas, the Grapes of Wrath was burned in front of the library. In the streets where he spent his childhood, his books were being set on fire. The writer began receiving death threats. The FBI put him under surveillance, but he did not step back, because even First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt went on the radio and supported him, saying, "Everyone should read this book. The story is terrible, but it is true." In 1940, this work brought him the Pulitzer Prize. With The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck had made the voice of the oppressed heard by the whole world. However, the price of this victory was heavy. He could no longer be the quiet man who loved to disappear in crowds. He was now a folk hero and, at the same time, a target. Moreover, the world was drifters toward a much greater disaster, the Second World War. Steinbeck's pen now had to fight on a different front. When the storm created by the Grapes of Wrath subsided, John Steinbeck was exhausted. He was now a celebrity, known by all, hated by some, worshipped by others, but he hated this noise. To escape the chaos of people, there was only one thing he could do: set sail, and with his best friend, his soulmate, Ed Ricketts. In 1940, Steinbeck and Ricketts chartered a sardine boat named the Western Flyer. Their route was the Gulf of California, the Sea of Cortez. This journey was not just an expedition to collect biological specimens. For Steinbeck, it was a ritual of purification. Far from the political fights on land and the threatening letters, he took refuge in the simple and honest world of starfish, crabs, and tides. The conversations they had on the deck of the boat reshaped Steinbeck's mind. He learned to look at humanity not from above, but as a biological species. What remained from this journey was the book The Log from the Sea of Cortez, where philosophy and science intertwined. Steinbeck perhaps spent the most peaceful days of his life on that boat, but when they returned to shore, the world was in flames. World War II had broken out. Steinbeck was not a man to sit in his corner and write novels. He wanted to do something for his country. First, he fought with his pen. In 1942, he wrote the novel The Moon is Down. It told the story of an unnamed European town occupied by Nazis and the people's silent resistance. The book was so effective that it was secretly passed from hand to hand in occupied Europe, becoming a source of morale for resistance fighters. Possession of the book was grounds for execution in Nazi Germany. But sitting at a desk was not enough for him. In 1943, he went to the front as a war correspondent for the New York Herald Tribune. Steinbeck lived with soldiers under bullets and bombs on the North African and Italian fronts. He participated in special operations commanded by Douglas Fairbanks Jr. What he saw was far more terrifying than the poverty in the Grapes of Wrath. Shattered bodies, young soldiers trembling with fear, destroyed cities. He wrote about how dirty and ruthless war was. However, during this period, his private life was as chaotic as the front lines. His marriage to his first wife, Carol, had been crushed under the weight of fame and war. They divorced. Steinbeck married the singer Gwyn Conger and moved to New York. His two sons, Tom and John, were born from this marriage. Steinbeck was now a father, but the restlessness inside him did not subside. The war was over, but the real destruction for Steinbeck came in 1948. This year would be his nightmare year. First, He separated from his second wife, Gwyn, in a tumultuous manner. He had collapsed mentally and locked himself in an apartment. But the real blow came with a phone call from California. His closest friend, his mentor, the secret hero of his books, Ed Ricketts. One evening, while crossing the tracks in his car, he had been struck by the Del Monte Express. Steinbeck rushed to California as soon as he heard the news, but he couldn't make it in time. Ricketts had died. This loss shook Steinbeck to his core. Ricketts was his compass, his critic, his teacher, his other half. Something inside Steinbeck died, along with his friend. That old laboratory in Monterey was now empty. Steinbeck wrote in those days, "He is dead, and I am only half a man now." By the end of 1948, John Steinbeck was a wounded, lonely man severed from his roots. The California of his youth had changed, his friend was gone, his family had fallen apart. He had to bury the past and be reborn. From this pain, his most personal, most ambitious work, what he would call "my legacy to my children," would be born, East of Eden. No matter how far a man goes, his past follows him like a shadow. After burying his friend Ed Ricketts and ending his second marriage, John Steinbeck found himself in the middle of wreckage in his late 40s. Everyone thought he was finished. But Steinbeck was a man who knew how to rise from the ashes. This rebirth would come with a new love and the biggest project of his life. In 1949, he met the woman who would be his anchor for the rest of his life, Elaine Scott. Elaine was Texan, strong, cheerful, and full of enough life to scatter Steinbeck's dark moods. They married in 1950. Unlike Steinbeck's previous stormy relationships, Elaine became a calm harbor for him. Steinbeck settled in New York with Elaine. Physically, he was now very far from California, from that dusty valley. But his mind was still in the Salinas Valley, because there was one last great story to tell, a debt to be paid. Steinbeck wanted to tell his two young sons, Tom and John, where their family came from and the battle between good and evil in the world. He decided to write the massive novel that had been turning in his head for years, East of Eden. For this book, he said, "Everything I have written up to now has been practice for this book. This is my first book." The writing process was like a ritual. Every morning he sat at his desk, took his pencils out of a custom-made box, and sharpened their tips to perfection. He wrote exactly 2 pages a day, no more, no less. On the left page, he wrote letters to his editor and friend Pascal Covici. On the right page, he wrote the novel. East of Eden was not just a fictional story. Steinbeck placed his own mother's side, the Hamilton family, and his grandfather, Samuel Hamilton, inside the novel. He recreated the Salinas Valley of his childhood, the smell of the earth, the way the light fell on the valley, down to the finest detail. He adapted the biblical story of Cain and Abel to 20th century America. He immortalized the idea that man can change his destiny with that famous Hebrew word, timshel, thou mayest. During this period, Steinbeck was flirting not only with novels but also with cinema. He formed a deep friendship with the famous director Elia Kazan. The two worked together on the film Viva Zapata, telling the life of the Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata. But the real explosion would come with the film adaptation of East of Eden. Elia Kazan had chosen a young actor unknown to anyone until that day for the lead role, James Dean. When Steinbeck met James Dean on set, he saw his rebellious and fragile nature and said, "Yes, this is Cal Trask." When East of Eden was published in 1952, it was a huge success. The book was a bestseller, but the air back in Steinbeck's hometown of Salinas was icy once again. Old neighbors, relatives, and townspeople felt that Steinbeck had exposed their secrets, their brothels, and their sins. Steinbeck realized he could never again call the valley where he spent his childhood home. He was the valley's most famous child, but also the one most alien to it. By 1955, John Steinbeck was at the summit of the literary world. He had money, a happy marriage, and he had written his masterpiece. But the most dangerous thing for a writer is to run out of stories to tell. He was aging, his heart was skipping beats, and America, that old America, was changing rapidly. As highways, televisions, and consumer frenzy engulfed the country, Steinbeck wondered one last time, where did my country go? This curiosity would take him on his final great journey. By 1960, John Steinbeck was 58 years old. Small heart attacks reminded him of his mortality. But it wasn't death that scared him. What scared him was that he no longer recognized his country, America, to which he had dedicated his life. Sitting in his New York apartment, he said, "I have lost the pulse of the nation." Radios, televisions, and fast culture had swallowed the old, dusty, authentic America he knew. He decided to hit the road one last time, to rediscover his country. For this, he had a custom camper truck built. He named it Rocinante, inspired by Don Quixote's horse. He took maps, plenty of whiskey, and a single traveling companion, his standard French poodle, Charlie. Steinbeck and Charlie embarked on a journey that would last 10,000 miles. They drove from the forests of Maine to the cornfields of the Midwest, and from there to the hot lands of the South. Steinbeck wanted to talk to people, to understand what they were thinking. But what he found disappointed him. Cities had started to look alike. Local dialects were disappearing, and people were trapped in a plastic existence. Worst of all was the racism he witnessed in the South. When he saw a white mob in New Orleans screaming to prevent a black girl from entering a school, he felt sick. The book Travels with Charlie was born as a document of this sadness and disillusionment. 2 years after returning from his journey, in 1962, the phone rang. The Swedish Academy had awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature to John Steinbeck. This was the highest peak a writer could reach. However, this victory turned into a defense rather than a celebration for Steinbeck. The American press, especially the New York Times, criticized the decision harshly. According to them, Steinbeck's best years were behind him. He was an old-fashioned writer, and he did not deserve the award. Steinbeck was devastated by these criticisms. He told a friend, "The award felt like an autopsy performed before death, rather than after." Still, he went to Stockholm, took that podium, and gave one of the most impressive speeches in history. The writer is delegated to declare and to celebrate man's proven capacity for greatness of heart and spirit. After the Nobel, Steinbeck never wrote another novel. In the mid-1960s, America was torn in two by the Vietnam War. Steinbeck, once the hero of the workers, the oppressed, and the left, surprisingly stood by the government in this war. His sons were soldiers in Vietnam. He was close friends with President Lyndon B. Johnson. At the age of 64, rifle in hand, Steinbeck went to Vietnam, to the front lines. In letters he wrote from there, he defended the war. This situation completely alienated him from the younger generation, and the intellectual circles that had loved him for years. He was now a traitor to his old friends and a warmongering old man to the new generation. This was the most tragic contradiction of his life. After returning from Vietnam, his body began to fail. Pain in his back, the fading light in his eyes, and the weariness of his heart. On the evening of December 20th, 1968, in his New York apartment, while snow fell outside, John Steinbeck took his last breath. He was 66 years old. Per his will, his ashes were taken to the land he had fled for years, the land he both loved and hated, but into which he breathed his soul in every line, Salinas. He was entrusted to the wind of that valley in the Hamilton family plot. John Steinbeck did not just tell us about the dusty roads of the 1930s, the migrant workers, or the poor fishermen. He told us of mercy, solidarity, and the unquenchable light inside the human being. Today, the wind still blows the same in the Salinas Valley, and if you listen to that wind, you might hear the whisper of Tom Joad. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. The writer of the land has returned to the land, but his voice will continue to echo as long as humanity exists.